The rain hammered against the windows of the small Italian restaurant, tucked away on a quiet street corner. Inside, the warm glow of candlelight flickered across wooden tables where families shared their evening meals. The smell of fresh basil and garlic bread filled the air, mixing with the soft chatter of customers and the clinking of wine glasses. Marcus Sullivan sat in his limousine outside, staring at the modest establishment through tinted windows. His driver had gotten lost trying to find the exclusive steakhouse where he was supposed to meet his business partners. Instead, they ended up here, in a neighborhood Marcus hadn't visited in over 15 years. The GPS had failed them, and his phone battery had died. He was about to tell his driver to keep searching when something made him pause. Through the restaurant window, he saw a young boy sitting alone at a corner table. The boy had dark hair that fell across his forehead, and he was rocking slightly in his seat. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Even from this distance, even after all these years, he recognized those movements. His hands gripped the leather seat. Marcus had built an empire. He owned hotels across 3 continents, invested in tech companies that changed industries, and his name appeared on lists of the most powerful people in the world. But none of that mattered right now. His success had come at a price. 7 years ago, his wife Rebecca had left him, taking their son Daniel with her. She said Marcus cared more about his companies than his family. She said he couldn't accept Daniel for who he was. She said their son needed a father who would be present, not just provide. Daniel had been diagnosed with autism when he was 3. Marcus remembered feeling lost, angry, and ashamed of his own confusion. He didn't know how to connect with a child who didn't respond the way he expected. While Rebecca attended therapy sessions and learned about sensory issues and communication differences, Marcus buried himself in work. He told himself he was securing their future, but the truth was he was running away from something he didn't understand. The divorce was quick and cold. Rebecca moved to another city, and Marcus threw himself even deeper into his business. He sent money every month, generous amounts that covered private schools and therapies and anything Daniel might need. But he never visited. He never called. He told himself it was better this way, that Daniel was better off without a father who didn't know how to help him. Now, sitting in the rain outside this small restaurant, Marcus couldn't tear his eyes away from that boy in the window. His driver cleared his throat politely, asking if they should continue searching for the steakhouse. Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. The bell above the restaurant door chimed as Marcus entered. A few customers glanced up at the tall man in the expensive suit, water dripping from his shoulders, but most continued with their meals. Marcus stood near the entrance, his eyes adjusting to the warm light. He scanned the room until he found the corner table again. It was Daniel. 7 years had passed, but Marcus would know his son anywhere. The boy was 10 years old now, still small for his age, wearing a blue sweater that was slightly too big for him. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his eyes focused on something Marcus couldn't see from where he stood. Daniel's lips moved slightly as if he was counting or reciting something to himself. A young waitress approached Daniel's table carrying a tray with a plate of spaghetti. She had dark hair tied back in a ponytail and wore the restaurant's simple uniform of a white shirt and black apron. She set the plate down carefully and said something to Daniel. The boy didn't look up or respond, but the waitress didn't seem bothered. She smiled and adjusted the placement of his fork so it was perfectly parallel to his knife. Marcus felt frozen in place. His heart pounded in his chest. Part of him wanted to rush over to the table, to somehow make up for 7 years in a single moment. But another part of him, the part that had run away all those years ago, told him to leave. Daniel didn't need him. Daniel had managed just fine without him. Before Marcus could decide what to do, the restaurant owner approached him with a friendly smile. The man was in his 60s with gray hair and a thick mustache. He welcomed Marcus and gestured toward an empty table near the window. Marcus almost declined, almost turned around and walked back out into the rain. But his feet carried him forward, and he found himself sitting down at a table with a clear view of his son. The waitress who had served Daniel came over to take Marcus's order. Up close, he could see she was probably in her early 20s, with kind eyes and a gentle manner. Her name tag read Sophia. She handed him a menu and asked if he would like something to drink while he decided. Marcus ordered water, not trusting his voice to say much more. His eyes kept drifting back to Daniel. Sophia followed his gaze and noticed him watching the boy. Her expression softened. She leaned in slightly and spoke in a quiet voice as if sharing a secret. She told Marcus that Daniel came to the restaurant every Monday evening with his mother. His mother was a music teacher who gave lessons at a studio 2 blocks away. She would drop Daniel off at the restaurant at 6 o'clock, and he would have dinner while she finished her last lesson of the day. Then she would pick him up at 7:30. Marcus absorbed this information like a man dying of thirst. Every detail about his son's life felt precious and painful at the same time. He asked Sophia, trying to keep his voice casual, if the boy came alone. Sophia nodded and explained that Daniel preferred it that way. His mother had tried sitting with him at first, but Daniel got overwhelmed when the restaurant was busy and she was there. He did better when he could sit in his corner spot, eat his plain spaghetti with butter and nothing else, and have space to himself. Sophia said all this with such natural understanding that Marcus felt a wave of shame wash over him. This young waitress, a stranger, seemed to know his son better than he did. She understood Daniel's needs without judgment or frustration. She had probably spent more meaningful time with Daniel in these Monday evening dinners than Marcus had in the boy's entire life. Marcus asked what time it was. 7:15. His business dinner was definitely a lost cause now, but he didn't care. He couldn't leave. He sat at his table, his expensive suit still damp from the rain, his food untouched, and watched his son eat spaghetti one careful bite at a time. Daniel used his fork to wind exactly 3 strands of pasta at a time, a precise ritual that he repeated over and over. The restaurant continued its evening rhythm around them. Families laughed and talked. Couples shared desserts. Children ran between tables until their parents called them back. And in the corner, a 10-year-old boy sat alone, existing in his own quiet world, completely unaware that his father was watching him with a mixture of regret and longing, so intense it made his chest ache. Sophia brought Marcus his food, but he barely noticed. She glanced at him with a curious expression, as if she sensed something unusual about this well-dressed man who couldn't stop staring at the boy in the corner. But she said nothing and moved on to help other customers. The minutes ticked by. Marcus knew that at 7:30, Daniel's mother would arrive. Rebecca would walk through that door, and she would see him sitting here. He didn't know if he was ready for that confrontation, but he also knew he couldn't leave. At 7:20, something unexpected happened. Sophia walked over to Daniel's table carrying a violin case. Marcus sat up straighter, his attention sharpening. The waitress set the case gently on the chair beside Daniel and said something to him. For the first time that evening, Daniel looked up from his plate. His face, which had been neutral and focused, suddenly transformed with the hint of a smile. Daniel's hands reached for the case with more animation than Marcus had seen from him all night. The boy carefully unlatched the clasps and lifted out a small violin. It wasn't new or expensive looking. The wood was scratched in places and the bow seemed worn from use. But the way Daniel held the instrument with such careful reverence made it seem like the most precious thing in the world. Sophia stepped back and returned to her other duties. But Marcus noticed she kept glancing over at Daniel with an encouraging expression. Other customers began to notice too. A woman at a nearby table whispered to her husband and pointed. A little girl stopped eating her pizza to watch. The background noise of conversation began to quiet down. Daniel stood up from his seat, still holding the violin. He positioned it under his chin with practiced ease, adjusted his stance, and lifted the bow. Marcus felt his breath catch. He had no idea his son could play an instrument. Rebecca had never mentioned it in the brief, formal emails they exchanged about expenses and school reports. This was a complete revelation. Then Daniel began to play. The first notes drifted through the restaurant, soft and tentative. Marcus didn't recognize the piece, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the transformation he witnessed in his son. Daniel's body, which had been tense and self-contained all evening, seemed to relax. His eyes closed. His rocking movements, which Marcus had noticed earlier, now synchronized with the music in a way that seemed natural and right. The melody was beautiful. It started simple, almost like a lullaby, then grew more complex. Daniel's fingers moved across the strings with surprising confidence. There were a few missed notes, a few moments where the bow scratched awkwardly, but these imperfections only made the performance more genuine. This wasn't a professional concert. This was a 10-year-old boy expressing something he couldn't say with words. The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Everyone had stopped eating to listen. A businessman in the corner put down his phone. A tired mother with 3 young children held up her hand to keep them quiet. Even the kitchen staff had come to the doorway to watch. Sophia stood near the wall, her hands clasped together, her eyes glistening. Marcus felt something breaking apart inside his chest. He had spent 7 years telling himself that Daniel didn't need him, that his son was better off with just his mother, that Marcus had nothing to offer a child he couldn't understand. But watching Daniel play, seeing the pure joy and peace on his son's face, Marcus realized how much he had missed. How many moments like this had he thrown away because he was too afraid, too proud, too focused on things that didn't really matter? Daniel played for about 5 minutes, though it felt like time had stopped. The final notes hung in the air, sweet and clear. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the restaurant erupted in applause. People stood up from their tables, clapping and cheering. Daniel opened his eyes, and for just a second, Marcus saw something flicker across his son's face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was something like satisfaction or maybe relief. Sophia walked over to Daniel and said something close to his ear. The boy nodded and carefully placed the violin back in its case. The applause continued, but Daniel didn't acknowledge it. He simply sat back down at his table, his hands folding in front of him again, returning to his quiet world. But something had changed. The air in the restaurant felt different, charged with an emotion that Marcus couldn't quite name. An elderly woman at the table next to Marcus wiped tears from her eyes. She turned to her companion and said how beautiful it was, how special that boy was. Marcus wanted to stand up and tell everyone that Daniel was his son, that he was the father of this remarkable child. But shame kept him in his seat. What right did he have to claim Daniel now after all this time? Sophia began moving through the restaurant again, checking on customers, refilling water glasses. When she reached Marcus's table, she paused and looked at him more carefully. He must have looked strange, this wealthy man in his expensive suit with tears running down his face, his food cold and untouched. Sophia asked quietly if he was okay. Marcus couldn't speak. He just shook his head and looked down at his hands. Sophia pulled out the chair across from him and sat down without asking permission. It was a bold move for a waitress to make with a customer, but something in her expression told Marcus she understood more than she was letting on. She asked him directly if he knew Daniel. Marcus looked up at her, and the words tumbled out before he could stop them. He told her yes. He told her Daniel was his son. The admission hung between them. Sophia's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't look shocked. Instead, she looked sad. She asked how long it had been since Marcus had seen Daniel. 7 years, Marcus whispered. 7 years since the divorce. 7 years since he had walked away because he didn't know how to be the father Daniel needed. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Then she told Marcus something that changed everything. She said Daniel played the violin every Monday evening after his dinner. His mother had started bringing the violin about 6 months ago. At first, Daniel had only played a few notes before putting it away. But week by week, he had grown more comfortable. Now he played a complete piece almost every time. Sophia explained that she had asked Daniel's mother about it once. Rebecca had told her that music was Daniel's way of communicating what he felt inside. Words were difficult for him. Social interaction was overwhelming. But when he played the violin, he could express emotions he couldn't otherwise share. The music was his voice, his way of connecting with the world around him. Marcus absorbed this information with a mixture of wonder and heartbreak. His son had found a language that made sense to him, and Marcus had missed all of it. He asked Sophia why she encouraged Daniel to play in the restaurant. It seemed like an unusual thing to allow, especially during the dinner rush. Sophia smiled for the first time since sitting down. She told Marcus that the owner of the restaurant, Mr. Giovanni, had lost his own son many years ago. The boy had died in an accident when he was young. When Mr. Giovanni saw Daniel struggling with the noise and chaos of the restaurant, it reminded him of his own son, who had also been different from other children. So Mr. Giovanni told Sophia to do whatever she could to make Daniel comfortable. If that meant letting him play violin, then so be it. She continued, explaining that Daniel's music had become something special for everyone at the restaurant. Regular customers now tried to plan their Monday dinners to coincide with Daniel's performance. People brought their friends to experience it. The staff looked forward to it every week. In a strange way, This 10-year-old boy with autism had brought an entire community together without even trying. Marcus listened to all of this and felt the full weight of what he had lost. While he had been building hotels and closing business deals and appearing in magazines, his son had been here, creating something beautiful. Daniel had touched the lives of strangers, brought tears to the eyes of people he had never spoken to, and built connections in ways Marcus never could with all his money and power. Sophia reached across the table and touched Marcus's hand gently. She told him something that struck him like a physical blow. She said that every week after Daniel finished playing, he would look toward the door. Just for a few seconds, he would watch people coming in and out of the restaurant. Sophia believed he was looking for someone. Maybe his father. Maybe hoping that one day Marcus would walk through that door. Marcus felt like he couldn't breathe. The weight of his choices, his failures, his cowardice pressed down on him. He asked Sophia what he should do. Should he approach Daniel? Should he introduce himself? Should he try to explain where he had been for 7 years? Sophia shook her head gently. She told him that Daniel needed consistency and predictability. Surprising him, especially in his safe space at the restaurant, might not be the right approach. But she also said that it wasn't too late. If Marcus really wanted to be part of Daniel's life again, he needed to do the work. He needed to learn about autism, understand Daniel's needs, and be patient. Most importantly, he needed to be present, not just provide money from a distance. The bell above the door chimed. Marcus looked up and saw a woman entering the restaurant. She was older than he remembered, with a few gray streaks in her dark hair, but it was unmistakably Rebecca. His ex-wife scanned the restaurant, her eyes landing on Daniel in the corner. Then her gaze shifted and she saw Marcus sitting at his table. The blood drained from her face. Rebecca stood frozen near the entrance, her hand still on the door handle. For a moment, she looked like she might turn around and leave. But then her expression hardened, and she walked toward Daniel's table without acknowledging Marcus at all. She spoke softly to their son, asking if he had enjoyed his dinner. Daniel nodded once, his eyes still fixed on the empty plate in front of him. Sophia had quietly slipped away when Rebecca entered, giving the family space. Marcus watched as his ex-wife helped Daniel pack up his violin and gather his things. Rebecca's movements were practiced and efficient, the result of years of single parenting. She knew exactly how to interact with Daniel, when to speak and when to stay quiet, how to guide him without overwhelming him. Marcus felt like an outsider watching through glass. As Rebecca prepared to leave with Daniel, she finally looked directly at Marcus. Her eyes were cold, but underneath that ice he could see old pain and anger. She whispered something to Daniel about waiting by the door, then walked over to Marcus's table. She didn't sit down. She stood with her arms crossed, her posture defensive and rigid. Her first words were sharp and direct. She asked what he was doing here. Marcus stumbled over his explanation about the business dinner, the wrong turn, the coincidence of ending up at this exact restaurant on this exact Monday evening. As he spoke, he realized how weak it all sounded, how implausible. But it was the truth. Sometimes life pushed you toward the moments you had been running from. Rebecca's laugh was bitter. She said that in 7 years, Marcus had never once asked where they lived, what Daniel liked to do, how he spent his time. Now suddenly he shows up at their restaurant on a Monday evening and expects what? Forgiveness? A second chance to be a father? She told him he had no right to be here, that he had made his choice years ago when he decided his business empire was more important than his family. Marcus had no defense. Everything she said was true. He had chosen his work over his son. He had run away when things got difficult instead of learning and growing. He had sent money as if that could replace presence, as if Daniel needed a bank account more than a father. He looked down at his hands, unable to meet Rebecca's eyes, but then he told her about watching Daniel play the violin. He described the transformation he had witnessed, the beauty of the music, the way the entire restaurant had fallen silent to listen. He told her about Sophia explaining how the violin was Daniel's voice, his way of connecting with the world. Marcus's voice broke as he admitted that he had missed everything, that he had thrown away 7 years he could never get back. Rebecca's expression softened slightly, though suspicion remained in her eyes. She told Marcus that Daniel's journey with music had been long and difficult. At first, the sound of the violin had been too much for him, too intense, but a music therapist had worked with him patiently, helping him build tolerance and eventually love for the instrument. Now Daniel practiced every day. Music had opened doors for him that nothing else had been able to reach. She explained that Daniel still struggled with many things. He had trouble in school when the routine changed unexpectedly. Loud noises could send him into a shutdown that lasted hours. Social situations exhausted him in ways that people who didn't understand autism couldn't imagine. But he was also brilliant, especially with patterns and mathematics. He had memorized entire violin compositions after hearing them only a few times. He noticed details that others missed. He experienced the world in a way that was different, not less. Marcus listened to every word, hungry for information about the son he had abandoned. He asked if Daniel ever talked about him. Rebecca hesitated, then shook her head. She said Daniel rarely asked about his father. In the beginning, right after the divorce, he had asked a few times where Daddy was, but when Marcus never called or visited, Daniel eventually stopped asking. Children learned quickly who they could count on. The words cut through Marcus like knives, but he deserved every wound. He asked Rebecca if there was any way he could be part of Daniel's life again. He knew he had no right to ask, that he had forfeited his place in their family. But watching Daniel play tonight had awakened something in Marcus that had been sleeping for too long. He couldn't walk away again. He wouldn't survive it. Rebecca looked toward the door where Daniel waited patiently, his violin case held carefully in both hands. She turned back to Marcus and said something that surprised him. She told him that despite everything, despite all the pain and abandonment, Daniel deserved to have a father if that father was willing to truly show up. Not just with money or occasional visits, but with real presence and commitment. She said she would have to think about it, that she needed to protect Daniel from being hurt again. Marcus nodded quickly, agreeing to whatever conditions she wanted to set. He gave her his personal cell phone number, not his assistant's line or his office number. He told her to take whatever time she needed to decide. He would wait. He would prove that he had changed, that he was ready to do the hard work of being the father Daniel deserved. Before Rebecca walked away, Marcus asked her one more question. He wanted to know what piece Daniel had played tonight. Rebecca's expression softened completely for the first time. She told him it was a simplified version of a Vivaldi concerto. The music teacher who gave Daniel lessons had adapted it to his skill level. Daniel had been working on it for 3 months, practicing the same measures over and over until they were perfect. She added, almost as an afterthought, that Daniel chose that particular piece because he had heard it in a movie once. The movie was about a father and son who had been separated and found each other again through music. Daniel had watched the movie dozens of times, rewinding certain scenes repeatedly. Rebecca had always wondered if some part of Daniel was holding on to hope that his own father might come back someday. Marcus felt tears streaming down his face again. He didn't care who saw him crying in this public restaurant. The image of his son watching that movie over and over, perhaps dreaming of a reunion that Marcus had made impossible through his own weakness, was almost too much to bear. He promised Rebecca that he would do better. He would be better. Rebecca gathered Daniel and left the restaurant without another word. Marcus watched them go, his son's small figure disappearing into the rainy night. Sophia returned to his table after they left and asked if she could get him anything else. Marcus shook his head. He asked for his bill, over-tipping so generously that Sophia's eyes widened. He told her that she had given his son something precious by encouraging his music and creating a safe space for him. The money was nothing compared to that gift. As Marcus prepared to leave, Mr. Giovanni, the restaurant owner, appeared at his table. The older man had been watching from the kitchen. He sat down without invitation and looked at Marcus with wise, sad eyes. He told Marcus that he had heard some of the conversation with Rebecca. He understood what Marcus was going through because he had his own regrets about his late son. Mr. Giovanni explained that his boy had been sick for years before he died. During that time, Mr. Giovanni had worked constantly, trying to earn enough money for treatments and doctors. He thought he was doing the right thing, providing for his family. But when his son passed away, Mr. Giovanni realized he had missed so much time with him. He had been so focused on saving his son's life that he had forgotten to actually live that life with him. The old man told Marcus that regret was a heavy burden to carry, but it could also be a teacher. The question was whether Marcus would let his regret crush him or transform him. He said that Daniel came to the restaurant every Monday. If Marcus wanted to rebuild a relationship with his son, he knew where to find him, but Mr. Giovanni warned that it wouldn't be easy. Trust that had been broken took years to rebuild, especially with a child who already struggled with understanding the social world. Marcus thanked the restaurant owner for his wisdom and his kindness to Daniel. He promised he would be back next Monday. Mr. Giovanni smiled and told him that Sophia would save his table. As Marcus walked out into the rain, he felt different than when he had arrived. The successful billionaire who had entered the restaurant an hour ago felt like a hollow shell. The man leaving was broken, but perhaps that breaking was necessary. Perhaps he needed to fall apart completely before he could rebuild himself into someone worthy of being Daniel's father. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle. Marcus's driver waited by the limousine, but Marcus waved him off. He needed to walk, to think, to process everything that had happened. His mind spun with plans and possibilities. He would hire the best autism specialists to teach him how to support Daniel. He would clear his Monday evenings permanently, making them sacred time that no business deal could interrupt. He would learn about sensory sensitivities and communication differences, and all the things he should have learned 10 years ago. But beneath all these practical plans was a deeper realization. Marcus had spent his entire adult life building an empire because he thought success and power would make him somebody important. But tonight, watching his 10-year-old son play a scratched violin in a small Italian restaurant, Marcus understood that he had been chasing the wrong things. The most important thing he could ever be was present for Daniel. Not perfect, not even fully understanding, but present and trying and committed. The week that followed was the longest of Marcus's life. He canceled 3 major meetings and postponed a trip to Dubai that his partners said was crucial. For the first time in his career, Marcus told his board of directors that he had personal matters to attend to, and they would simply have to wait. The shocked silence on the conference call told him how unprecedented this was. Marcus spent his days researching autism. He read books written by autistic adults sharing their experiences. He watched videos of parents describing their journeys with their children. He hired a consultant who specialized in autism education for families. Every article, every resource, every piece of information felt like a window into a world he should have explored years ago. He learned about stimming behaviors, about the way sensory input could be overwhelming or soothing, about how communication happened in many forms beyond words. The consultant, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, met with Marcus in his penthouse office. She listened to his story without judgment, though he saw sadness in her eyes when he described the 7 years of absence. She told him plainly that reconnecting with Daniel would require patience and humility. Autistic children, like all children, understood abandonment even if they couldn't always articulate it. Daniel had learned to live without his father, and Marcus would need to prove he was trustworthy before Daniel could feel safe opening his heart again. Dr. Chen gave Marcus homework. She asked him to write down everything he remembered about Daniel from before the divorce. What did he like? What upset him? What were his routines? Marcus sat at his desk late into the night, trying to recall memories he had buried under layers of work and avoidance. He remembered Daniel lining up his toy cars in perfect rows. He remembered the way Daniel would hum the same tune repeatedly while playing. He remembered bath time struggles because Daniel hated the feeling of water on his face. These memories, once so frustrating to Marcus, now felt precious. He wrote them all down, even the difficult ones. Dr. Chen reviewed his notes during their next session and helped him understand what he had been seeing. The car lining was organizing behavior, a way for Daniel to create order in a confusing world. The humming was self-soothing. The bath time struggles were sensory sensitivities that could have been addressed with different techniques. Everything that had seemed like defiance or strangeness had been Daniel's way of coping and communicating. Marcus also reached out to Rebecca through email. He kept his messages brief and respectful, not wanting to pressure her. He simply told her that he was educating himself about autism and that he hoped she would consider allowing him to see Daniel again. He included Dr. Chen's contact information in case Rebecca wanted to speak with her. For 3 days, Rebecca didn't respond. Marcus checked his email obsessively, hope and fear warring in his chest. On Thursday evening, Rebecca finally replied. Her email was cautious and measured. She wrote that she had spoken with Daniel's therapist about Marcus's request. The therapist had suggested a gradual reintroduction if Marcus was serious about being consistently present. Rebecca proposed that Marcus could come to the restaurant again on Monday, but this time she would tell Daniel in advance that his father would be there. They wouldn't interact yet. Marcus would simply be in the same space, allowing Daniel to process his presence. Marcus agreed immediately. He understood that this was a test and he was determined to pass it. He spent the rest of the week preparing himself emotionally for Monday. He practiced managing his expectations with Dr. Chen. She reminded him repeatedly that Daniel might not show any reaction to seeing him. Autistic children often processed emotions internally, and what looked like indifference might actually be intense feeling that Daniel didn't know how to express. When Monday finally arrived, Marcus cleared his entire schedule. He told his assistant that he was unavailable for any reason. He dressed more casually than usual, following Dr. Chen's advice not to appear too formal or intimidating. He arrived at the restaurant at 5:45, 15 minutes before Daniel and Rebecca usually showed up. Sophia greeted him with a warm smile. Mr. Giovanni had told her about the situation, and she had saved the same table Marcus had occupied the week before. She brought him water and told him gently that whatever happened tonight, he was doing a brave thing by showing up. Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the nervousness constricting his throat. At exactly 6 o'clock, Rebecca and Daniel entered the restaurant. Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. Rebecca held Daniel's hand, guiding him to his usual corner table. Before they sat down, Rebecca bent and spoke quietly to Daniel, pointing toward where Marcus sat. Daniel's eyes followed her gesture. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, his expression neutral and unreadable. Then he turned away and sat down at his table without any visible reaction. Marcus felt disappointment wash over him, but he remembered Dr. Chen's words. No reaction didn't mean no impact. He stayed in his seat, maintaining the distance Rebecca had requested. He ordered food he didn't plan to eat, going through the motions of being a regular customer. But his attention never wavered from Daniel. The boy went through his usual routine. He ate his plain spaghetti with the same careful precision. He rocked slightly in his seat. He seemed completely absorbed in his own world. But Marcus noticed something the staff might not have seen. Every few minutes, Daniel's eyes would flick toward Marcus's table just for a second, before returning to his plate. It was so quick that someone who wasn't watching carefully would have missed it. Rebecca sat at a different table this time, not with Daniel, but close enough to intervene if needed. She watched both Daniel and Marcus, her expression guarded. Marcus wanted to go over and thank her for this chance, but he stayed where he was. This night wasn't about him. It was about Daniel feeling safe and comfortable. Sophia brought Daniel his violin at 7:20, just like the previous week. Marcus braced himself for the moment his son would begin to play. When Daniel stood and positioned the instrument, Marcus noticed his hands were shaking slightly. It was subtle, but it was there. Daniel was nervous, and Marcus realized with a painful clarity that his presence was affecting his son, even if Daniel couldn't or wouldn't show it openly. The first notes Daniel played were uncertain, wavering. It wasn't like the previous week's confident performance. Daniel stopped after a few measures, lowered the violin, and stood still. The restaurant, which had again fallen silent in anticipation, waited. Marcus held his breath. He saw Rebecca tense in her seat, ready to go to Daniel if needed. Then Sophia did something remarkable. She walked over to Daniel and knelt beside him so she was at his eye level. She spoke quietly, too softly for Marcus to hear. Whatever she said made Daniel nod slowly. Sophia stood up and moved back, giving him space. Daniel raised the violin again, closed his eyes, and began to play. This time the music was different. It started with the same Vivaldi piece from the previous week, but then it shifted into something new. The melody became simpler, more personal. It reminded Marcus of a lullaby, something a parent might sing to a child at bedtime. The notes carried a weight of emotion that seemed impossible to come from such a small violin and such young hands. Marcus understood suddenly that Daniel was communicating. The music was his way of acknowledging that his father was there, that this moment was significant. that feelings were present, even if words were not. Tears blurred Marcus's vision. Around the restaurant, he heard quiet sniffles and saw people reaching for napkins. Even the tough-looking businessman in the corner wiped his eyes. When Daniel finished playing, the applause was even more enthusiastic than the previous week. But this time, instead of simply sitting down, Daniel turned and looked directly at Marcus. Their eyes met across the restaurant. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds, Marcus felt seen by his son for the first time in 7 years. Then Daniel carefully packed away his violin and returned to his seat. Rebecca came over to Marcus's table after Daniel sat down. Her eyes were red, though she hadn't allowed herself to cry fully. She told Marcus quietly that the lullaby melody Daniel had played was something she used to sing when he was a baby. It was a song Daniel associated with comfort and safety. By playing it tonight, he had been expressing something that he couldn't say out loud. Rebecca's voice caught as she admitted that maybe, just maybe, Daniel remembered his father more than she had realized. She told Marcus he could come back next Monday. They would continue this gradual process, letting Daniel adjust to his presence. Dr. Chen had suggested that after a few weeks of this parallel presence, they might try a brief, structured interaction. But Rebecca made it clear that everything would move at Daniel's pace. If Daniel showed signs of distress or regression, they would slow down or stop. Marcus agreed without hesitation. The following months became a new rhythm in Marcus's life. Every Monday evening, he sat at his table in the small Italian restaurant while Daniel sat at his corner table. Week by week, the distance between them seemed to shrink, though they remained at separate tables. Marcus learned to read the subtle signs of Daniel's emotional state. He could tell if his son was having a good day or a difficult one by the way he held his fork or the speed of his rocking. By the third week, Daniel began playing pieces that Marcus recognized. Rebecca told him that Daniel had been listening to music in the car on the drive to the restaurant, asking her to play certain songs over and over. She believed he was choosing music that meant something to him, pieces that carried messages he wanted to share. One week it was a cheerful Mozart sonata. Another week it was a melancholy folk tune. Each piece felt like a window into Daniel's inner world. Marcus's business partners and employees noticed the change in him. He no longer worked 16-hour days. He protected his Monday evenings with fierce determination. When a crisis erupted at one of his hotels in Singapore, Marcus delegated the response instead of flying there himself. His board of directors expressed concern about his new priorities, but Marcus found he didn't care. For years, he had believed his worth came from his business success. Now he understood that his worth came from showing up for his son, even in these small, quiet ways. Dr. Chen continued meeting with Marcus weekly. She helped him process the complex emotions that arose during this slow reconnection. Guilt, hope, fear, and love tangled together until Marcus sometimes felt overwhelmed. But Dr. Chen reminded him that healing from abandonment took time for both the parent and the child. She celebrated each small milestone with him, like the evening when Daniel maintained eye contact with Marcus for 5 full seconds, or the night when Daniel chose a seat at his table that faced toward Marcus's instead of away. In the 5th week, Rebecca approached Marcus with a new proposal. Daniel's therapist believed he was ready for a structured interaction. Rebecca suggested that after Daniel played his violin the following Monday, Marcus could approach his table to tell him directly that his playing was beautiful. It would be brief, no more than a minute, and Marcus would need to respect Daniel's space by not touching him or expecting a verbal response. Marcus spent the entire week preparing for that 1 minute. He practiced what he would say, keeping it simple and honest. Dr. Chen role-played the interaction with him, helping him understand that Daniel might not respond at all, or might respond in unexpected ways. She reminded Marcus that success wasn't measured by Daniel's reaction, but by Marcus showing up authentically. When the moment finally came, Marcus felt more nervous than he had before any business presentation in his life. Daniel had just finished playing a particularly beautiful rendition of a Bach piece. As the applause died down, Marcus stood from his table. His legs felt weak as he crossed the restaurant floor. He could feel every eye in the room watching him, including Rebecca's careful, protective gaze. Marcus stopped a respectful distance from Daniel's table. He spoke clearly but gently, telling Daniel that his playing was the most beautiful music Marcus had ever heard. He said that he was proud to be Daniel's father, and that he hoped someday they could know each other better. Then, following the plan they had practiced, Marcus simply nodded and returned to his own table without waiting for a response. Daniel had watched him during the entire brief speech. His expression remained neutral, but his hands had gripped the edge of the table. After Marcus sat back down, Daniel did something unexpected. He reached into his violin case and pulled out a small piece of paper. He folded it carefully, then stood and walked toward Marcus's table. The restaurant went silent. Rebecca half rose from her seat, uncertain whether to intervene. Daniel stopped beside Marcus's table and placed the folded paper next to Marcus's untouched plate. Then he returned to his own seat without a word. Marcus's hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. On it, in careful handwriting, was a single sentence. "Music is how I talk." "Can you hear me?" Marcus pressed the paper to his chest as tears streamed down his face. Around the restaurant, people weren't even trying to hide their crying anymore. Sophia stood by the kitchen door with her hands over her mouth. Mr. Giovanni emerged from the kitchen with tears on his weathered cheeks. Even the tough businessman who came every week was wiping his eyes openly. This note represented more than just words on paper. It was Daniel offering his father a bridge, a way to connect across the gap that had separated them for so long. Marcus understood now that he didn't need to fix Daniel or make him communicate in typical ways. He just needed to listen in the language Daniel spoke. And that language was music. Over the following weeks, a new pattern emerged. Daniel would play his violin, and afterward Marcus would tell him what emotions the music had made him feel. Sometimes Marcus said the music felt like joy. Sometimes he said it felt like missing someone. Once, when Daniel played something particularly complex and turbulent, Marcus said it felt like being confused but still trying. After each comment, Daniel would nod slightly, a sign that Marcus was beginning to understand. Rebecca slowly warmed to Marcus's presence in their lives. She saw the genuine effort he was making, the education he had pursued, the consistency he maintained. She began sharing small details about Daniel's week with Marcus, telling him about successes at school or challenges with sensory issues. Marcus listened to everything hungrily, building a picture of his son's daily life. 4 months after that first accidental visit to the restaurant, Rebecca made a suggestion that took Marcus's breath away. She proposed that Marcus might join them at Daniel's table for dinner. Not to talk or force interaction, but simply to share the same space. Daniel's therapist had approved the idea, believing Daniel was ready for this next step. That Monday evening, when Daniel and Rebecca arrived at the restaurant, Marcus was already seated at the corner table. His heart pounded as they approached. Rebecca spoke quietly to Daniel, reminding him of what they had discussed. Daniel looked at Marcus, then at the table, then nodded once. He sat down in his usual spot, and Rebecca took the seat beside him. Marcus sat across from them, careful not to intrude into Daniel's space. They ate dinner together in comfortable silence. Marcus had learned that silence wasn't empty for Daniel. It was full of observation and processing and presence. Occasionally, Daniel would glance at Marcus, and Marcus would offer a small smile without expecting one in return. When Sophia brought the violin, Daniel played his piece with what seemed like extra care. And when he finished, Marcus said what he had been feeling for months. "Thank you for letting me hear you, son. The transformation didn't happen overnight." There were difficult moments and setbacks. Some weeks Daniel seemed to retreat into himself, and Marcus worried that he was pushing too hard. But Rebecca and Dr. Chen helped him understand that progress wasn't linear. Healing moved forward and backward, and the important thing was Marcus's continued presence through all of it. By the time a year had passed since that first accidental encounter, Marcus's life looked completely different. He had restructured his business to allow for a better balance. He had sold 2 of his hotels and stepped back from several boards. His wealth remained vast, but his definition of richness had changed. The richest moments of his week were Monday evenings in a small Italian restaurant, watching his son create beauty through music. Daniel still didn't speak much to Marcus, but they had developed their own language. Daniel would play pieces that expressed what he felt, and Marcus would respond with words that showed he understood. Slowly, Daniel began leaving Marcus small notes after his performances. Usually just a sentence or 2, but each one was a gift Marcus treasured more than any business deal. One Monday evening, Nearly 14 months after Marcus had first walked through the restaurant door, something remarkable happened. After Daniel finished playing, he walked over to where Marcus sat and did something he had never done before. He held out his violin and bowed toward his father. Marcus looked at Rebecca, uncertain what this meant. She nodded encouragingly, her eyes shining with tears. Marcus took the violin carefully, understanding the profound trust Daniel was offering. The instrument was Daniel's most precious possession, his voice, his way of connecting with the world. By sharing it, Daniel was saying something words couldn't fully capture. Marcus held the violin awkwardly, having no idea how to play it properly. He drew the bow across the strings, creating a sound that was more scratch than music. Daniel smiled. It was small and fleeting, but it was real. That smile broke something open in Marcus's chest. He handed the violin back to Daniel carefully and said, "Maybe you could teach me someday." Daniel considered this for a long moment, then nodded once. It was a promise for the future, an acknowledgement that they had time now, time that Marcus would not waste again. The restaurant had become sacred ground for this small family rebuilding itself. Sophia had been promoted to manager, partly because Mr. Giovanni recognized how instrumental she had been in creating a space where Daniel could flourish. The Monday evening performances had become legendary in the neighborhood. People reserved tables weeks in advance, hoping to experience the magic of the boy with autism, who spoke through his violin, and the father who had learned to listen. Marcus never forgot that he had stumbled into this second chance purely by accident. A wrong turn, a dead phone battery, a coincidence that felt like grace. He wondered sometimes what would have happened if his driver hadn't gotten lost that night. Would he still be working 16-hour days, building an empire while missing the most important thing in his life? The thought made him shudder. Now, sitting across from his son every Monday evening, watching Daniel's face transform when he played, Marcus understood what true success meant. It wasn't wealth or power or recognition. It was being present for the people who needed you. It was learning to hear the language they spoke, even when that language was music instead of words. It was showing up, week after week, even when it was hard, even when you felt inadequate, even when you didn't know if you were making a difference. Daniel had taught Marcus how to hear in new ways, and in learning to hear his son, Marcus had found himself again, not the billionaire who had walked into the restaurant that rainy Monday evening, but someone deeper and more real. A father, imperfect, still learning, but finally truly present, and in the small Italian restaurant that had brought them together, surrounded by strangers who had become witnesses to their healing, Marcus and Daniel continued building a bridge of music and patience and love that would carry them both into the future.